2, 3, and how's that go? That's it.
Now that the hull is shut, we've moved on to caulking. Caulking being the sealing of each of these seams to make it watertight, which in this case doesn't mean squirting something out of a tube, as caulking mostly means to most people these days, but it means actually driving fibers in between that will be heavily compressed and will actually form a watertight seal. In this case, I'm using cotton, and I'm probably mostly just going to use cotton. The seams on this boat are pretty tight. Cotton compresses a lot, so it's better for tight seams. If you have much larger seams, you want stuff called oakum, which traditionally is made out of old rigging from boats. It's tarred hemp. They would actually send old rigging from boats and ships to prisons for inmates in prisons to basically thrash the rope until it came apart into its individual fibers, and then it was shipped off to the Navy or to the whatever shipyards were building. This planking finishes at about 1.25 inches thick, so the what does that work out to? That works out to 1.5. So there's a caulking seam is about 3/4 inch deep. I'm aiming to have about 1/2 inch of material in there, and then about 1/4 inch gap, which then gets paid is the term, paid with a seam compound, which will just add to the watertightness of all this and protect the fibers from being damaged by marine environment and whatnot. So yeah, these are all fairly tight seams for the most part, so cotton's working pretty well. Getting through rather a lot of it. I'm getting there. So. I'm not completely done with fairing yet, which I would, in principle, prefer to have fairing done before caulking, because I worry about the various tools you use for fairing getting snagged on the fibers and all that. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule as to what order you do those things in, but it seems more straightforward and easier, and to get a better product by doing it after fairing. But that being said, what I really need to do at the moment is pour pitch into the lowest crevices in the bilge on the inside of the boat. And to do that, you really want to have the lower parts of the boat caulked, so that if those seams are open at all, the pitch doesn't find its way into the seam and come out of the boat, which is not helpful to anybody. So all of the lower parts of the boat are faired, and we're working on caulking those preparatory to pitching. Come this way. So caulking tools are a whole other menagerie of interesting tools that are specific to this trade. Firstly, the mallets that you use. I'm not completely clear on the rationale as to why this shape is the shape that you want, but it definitely is. If you're doing this for a long time, this somehow is just more ergonomic than using other types of mallet. Partly, I think, because the slits they do a bit of shock absorption, and you have all of the mass of it entirely in line with your strike. I have to think that has something to do with it, but I am not an expert on that. This is a really lovely mallet. This is actually a C. Drew mallet that I was lucky enough to find years ago. So you have that. There's also, though, there is really nothing wrong with using other kinds of mallets or hammers or whatever, as long as you're using them appropriately. On the underside of the boat, where there's not a lot of room to swing upwards, I tend to use a copper-faced mallet. Copper-face is nice because it's hard enough to get a good strike, but it doesn't actually damage the irons that you use by hitting it because it's softer. So we have a very wide array of irons that are all for different things. You have what you would call, I think, well, there's all kinds of terms, and I feel like most people involved in caulking have their own take on what the terms are and mean. I would call this either a making iron or a threading iron. So this is the first one that you use. This is for getting your initial tucks of whatever material, whether it's cotton or oakum or whatever, into your seam. You move up to setting or hardening irons, which can get pretty massive depending on the size boat, the size seams that you're working on, and they often have single or double creases in them, which something about that gets a really good set. It sets like the edges of the caulking in a way that if you didn't have that crease, it wouldn't. You also have cranked irons, which are helpful for things like working the garboard seam against the keel, where you can't quite get your hand in another way. This allows you to kind of get in there. You have these guys, which I've actually, I have to confess, I have never used this. I still do not actually know what the correct application of this is. It's just a little bit embarrassing, but I know it has a use somewhere, and I will come across it one day. I have no doubt. And then you have reefing hooks, which there are all different sizes of reefing hooks. This is my favorite. And these are actually made by a dear friend, Med Chandler, Ships Koi Forge up in New Hampshire. A wonderful man, incredibly talented blacksmith. These are for removing caulking, which even the best of us, when we're caulking, we sometimes have to go back and do a bit. Like, ooh, I didn't quite put enough material in, it's driving too far to the back, which you don't want. And then you pull it out and you do that bit again with a little bit more material. And then of course, when you're doing maintenance, if you're reefing out seams to re-caulk, this is what you use for that. I set up this little practice board for teaching volunteers how to do caulking. And it's a little bit informative, I think, as to the shape of seams. So you can actually see on edge here, your ideal seam, there's between 1/2 and 1/3 of the plank's thickness is in good contact at the back of the seam. So there's wood to wood contact back there, which will seal very tight when the wood swells up. And that's where you're getting most of your actual water tightness from. The cotton or the oakum should really be secondary, ideally. And then from there, you have a caulking bevel, which we cut on one face, or one edge rather, of every plank, which gives you a space, like a wedged space to drive material into. And you're trying to get it to the back of that, but not onto the flat, because then you're actually holding the planks apart, which is no good. Whereas if it's sitting where it's supposed to, in here, it's actually wedging the planks tightly against each other. So over time, the sound that you're making as you're driving material into the hull, it actually it sounds tighter and tighter. You can actually hear it as you go on, which is kind of cool. Yeah, so Dane's picking it up quickly. He's actually graduated to working on the boat already, so yeah. Probably want to tuck a little bit more of that in before twisting them together. Yeah, you want like that much twist together.
Alright.
Like that.
Does that need to be opened up more? Probably.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
Anything in particular I should demonstrate?
No, just right now you're opening up a seam a little bit.
Yeah, this is a dumb iron as I'm learning. It's shaped so to ease the edges of the planks a little bit so that you can actually get the caulk in.
I see.
Because there's enough irregularities to make it a useful tool. And a necessary one. I describe that not because I'm an expert, but because teaching helps me learn. I think. All right. So, Tommy 2-tap. Apparently professionals don't tap twice, so. And I refuse to be a professional. So. These are the most awkward bit to do.